to the people of Baltimore. I heard your call for no justice, no peace.
There's a lot of brothers and women, too, that's incarcerated for things they had nothing to do with.
BPD engages in a pattern or practice of making unconstitutional stops, searches, and arrests.
Listening to the inaugural episode of the AFRO First Edition. I'm your host, Sean Yoes. I'm Baltimore editor of the Afro-American newspaper. I'm sitting here with Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby. Let's talk about, you mentioned earlier in our conversation, or earlier, the DOJ consent decree. Mm-hmm. The Department of Justice came into the city of Baltimore just a couple of short months after you indicted these 6 police officers.
A week after I arrived.
It was a week?
Yes, a week.
When the DOJ, the report was completed and published, it was one of the most scathing in the history of the Department of Justice.
And it was 2 weeks after I dropped the charges and said that there were some definite reforms that needed to take place within the police department.
How on earth what were you thinking? I keep asking you, what were you thinking? But when you saw the affirmation of what you had known, what you had experienced firsthand, what black Baltimoreans had known for generations, that this was a police department that had systematically taken away the constitutional rights of black citizens, mostly poor, mostly black citizens in our city for decades. What were you thinking about when you saw the totality of that report?
So, I mean, I think I was thinking what a lot of folks who live in the heart of West Baltimore were thinking. This is not a surprise, right? You know, my life experiences as being a black woman living in the heart of West Baltimore, from the inner city of a metropolitan area, like, this is not new. These are some of the real life experiences of communities of color. So I wasn't surprised.
But then, and I understand that, and I don't think I was surprised, and myriad people that I know weren't surprised. But
the only thing that did surprise me, though, was that so much of it was being done in the presence of the Department of Justice.
Well, you speak to the fact that we have experienced over the last several months, I believe in March of this year, the DOJ has handed down federal charges of racketeering. Initially for 7 members of the gun trace task force. Now there's 8. Mm-hmm. And these officers were operating beyond the law, unlawfully, shaking down, literally robbing residents of Baltimore, false charges, false arrest. I mean, you name it, and it's all in black and white in the charges against these officers. But they were, what is so incredible is that they were operating when the Department of Justice was in the city investigating. What does that say to you about the level of corruption in the Baltimore City Police Department?
So what I want to say is that I don't believe that it's every Baltimore police officer. First and foremost, I believe that this is an honorable profession, having come from police officers, that they risk their lives for the community, and the majority of them are taking time away from their families in order to do so. But they're just like in every profession, you have bad actors. And so I believe that you have to root those bad actors out. You have to hold them accountable. And I'm hopeful now that we have this spotlight on the department that we'll be able to do that. Now that we know that accountability is going to be had, that we'll be able to do that. And so from my perspective, what was troubling to me hearing those allegations is the larger sort of implication that it has on the trust of the community. You see, for me to do my job, right, and to make sure that we are safe, we rely on the trust of the community. And so hearing that, these officers, and alleged, and not all of them have pled guilty, some of them have, but to have these sorts of allegations lodged against them where they're robbing, drug dealers, and people are dying as a result, being killed.
And they're actually dealing drugs, allegedly, according to the the charges.
And to know that people have actually been killed as a result of their actions is extremely troubling to me. So unfortunately, I had to make some really difficult decisions. And it wasn't difficult because it went to their credibility as officers. And I had to get rid of a number of those cases and some of them, I mean, it's a matter of public safety because these were really bad guys. But at the end of the day, the integrity of those officers were called into question. So my role, again, is to ensure that we have community trust. And we ended up getting rid of a lot of those cases involving those officers.
And I want to come back to you having to get rid of many cases, hundreds of cases, connected to even another set of circumstances. But I want to go back to, I believe, the youngest officer who was part of the original Baltimore 7. He came forward. They're all set. Well, now 8 are locked up.
8.
But one of them came forward and said, I should be released on bail because everybody does it within the Baltimore City. This is his claim is that it is business as usual. I believe, like you stated, that the vast majority of police officers in Baltimore City operate honorably. I believe that. I do believe that. But for that statement to be made, there may be more corruption within that department than many of us may want to believe. And then when you extend it even further to what you have had to deal with the body camera footage, that has to be, first of all, affirmation of the DOJ's findings, but also affirmation of you taking what was an unprecedented stand and indicting those officers. But talk about this back and forth that you've had recently between you and the department over the body camera footage, officers allegedly planning evidence in cases. The cases connected to this body camera footage, 900 cases or close to 900 cases have been tainted and have been thrown out by your office. Let's speak to that a little bit.
So I believe and I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I believe it's 900, which includes the federally indicted officers as well as the body-worn cameras that we've kind of had to go back and expend a great deal of resources in reviewing those cases. Clearly, I don't want to ever have to be in a position to have to drop cases, but again, it's the misrepresentation of the truth has a direct sort of impact on the public's perception of the criminal justice system. And I would much rather get rid of, 800 cases than to undermine the public trust of more than 50,000 cases that we prosecute a year. And I can tell you that, there are going to be times that I disagree with the police commissioner and the body-worn camera footage. And the way that I've dealt with that issue is one of those times that we disagree. I have to, as a prosecutor, consider the legal sort of implications of misrepresenting the truth, which ultimately goes to an officer's credibility. And there are Supreme Court precedents, Giglio versus United States, where prosecutors have a duty to disclose evidence about the credibility of witnesses. So not only do we have a duty to disclose it, but in all likelihood, if it goes to their credibility, it's gonna be admissible at trial. And that's in every single case that officer is now a part of, right? And so again, I would much rather get rid of 900 than to compromise and undermine the public trust of 50,000.
The claim of several of the officers and the stance of the department in general, I think it's fair to say, is that that somehow they were reenacting crime scenes. Talk about how problematic that is from your perspective as the state's attorney for this city.
Whether it's planting evidence or reenacting the discovery and seizure of evidence, acting as if you found the evidence for the first time but for the 30 seconds before, we capture the fact that you didn't just discover it, you actually put it back down and acted as if you discovered it, and then you fail to mention that in your statement of probable cause, is a direct sort of misrepresentation of the truth that goes directly to your credibility. And that's the sort of concern that we have from a legal perspective, from a prosecutorial perspective, we would have to turn over and ultimately would be admissible in every case that they're in.
At the bottom line for all this, or rather the most important narrative, I suspect, in this discussion that we're having, is the fact that for the third year in a row, it looks like we are on pace to set a record as far as homicides are concerned. The year of the uprising had set a record. Last year we came down slightly, but this year we're on pace to surpass the record in 2015. There are all sorts of allegations about a department that is taking a knee, but ultimately, the fact that these homicides are taking place at a record level, I can't imagine what that must be like for you as a prosecutor, having as one of the main components of law enforcement and the criminal justice system, what that must be like for you.
So what I can say is it's incredibly frustrating, but I have to say this concept that the overall department is taking a knee, I don't necessarily agree with, because when we look at the number of cases that we're prosecuting, I told you we prosecute 50,000 cases a year in Baltimore City. We have last year a 93% felony conviction rate, right? We look at every single public enemy number one that's been designated the worst of the worst offenders by the Baltimore Police Department. We've convicted every single one. There's been 16, 5 cases are still pending. Out of those 11 individuals, all that we've convicted, they're serving 6 life sentences plus 598 years. We would not be able to, and I'll also show, there's been a 20% increase in the number of homicides that my prosecutors are dealing with. The national average for a homicide prosecutor should be 20 cases. My prosecutors have on average 54, right? Even despite that, we have an 80% conviction rate year to date. These sorts of numbers we would not be able to obtain without the cooperation of the police department. So I am not of the opinion that, the police department in totality is taking a knee. Are there some individuals that may feel that way within the department? Absolutely. That do not want to engage in proactive policing? Maybe, absolutely. But for the majority, we would not have these types of numbers without that cooperation. But when you talk about sort of the frustration from my perspective is that for far too long, we have not addressed those systemic issues that we are the root of crime, right? We haven't made the investment in our young people. So it's incredibly frustrating to me when we talk about unemployment, when we talk about housing, when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, right, that we've created on the same day on the Baltimore Sun that we had, city in crisis. You open up the inside page and they're talking about how they're cutting funding for schools and laying off teachers. Our priorities have been off for so long in our city. And so, people are saying, well, what do we do about it? Well, what we need to do is start investing long term. We need to ensure that those failed policies of the past, the war on drugs, the zero tolerance policing that has created this distrust among communities, we're doing something about that. And so I'm, from my perspective, doing everything that I can. I'm going to be reactive, which is the traditional role of a prosecutor, and hold people accountable. That's what we're doing. But at the same time, I want to ensure that we're seeing young people in classrooms as opposed to courtrooms, that we're giving people who deserve a second chance at triumph the ability to do so, and that we're not deeming people second-class citizens for the remainder of their life. What ends up happening when young people get felony convictions? They can no longer apply for a job, no longer apply for housing, can't go back to school because they can't get any financial aid. And so what other recourse do they have but to go out doing what they were doing in the first place? That in and of itself presents a public safety concern. That's the reason why we have aimed to be more for first-time nonviolent felony drug offenders. They go through a probationary period where they learn life skills and job training skills. They do community service, and at the end of that probationary period, they're given a job and their felony records are wiped clean. I would love to be able to expand that program. I've had some young people who have gone from being homeless to now being enrolled in community college. That's what's going to make the difference. I get into these schools and I can tell you for the past 3 years, in the height of the uprising, we adopted a school in the heart of West Baltimore. We increased the grant funding by more than 27%. We just recently got another grant where we have a youth coordinator that we've hired in the state's attorney's office. And we've expanded that program that targets fourth graders so that we have 2 schools in West Baltimore and 1 in East. People always ask, what can we do? Frederick Douglass said it best. It's easier to build strong children than it is to repair broken men.
You mentioned to me offline before we began the interview that the USA Today, of all publications, has come forward with an editorial praising your work and suggesting that more prosecutors around the country should maybe act as you have acted in the indictment of those 6 officers. That sounds like affirmation for all that you've done over these 3 years. It's gone, and it's incredible to believe that it's been 3 years and it's gone so quickly.
It feels like 30.
But how does that make? I don't want to say how does it make you feel, but ultimately, the USA Today is not necessarily a bastion of progressive thought. I don't think. It's interesting that they came out with that editorial.
Well, yeah, they did an op-ed, and they talked about my handling of the body-worn cameras, essentially having to dismiss several of those cases and understanding the bigger sort of picture and the role of a prosecutor, which is to ensure the trust of the community. And I think that it was definitely affirmation for what I've done. But I don't do it for affirmation, right? Like, at the end of the day, I'm doing this because this is my job, and regardless of what people think of me, I'm going to always do the right thing. And that's the beauty of being a prosecutor. I didn't know when I was growing up whether I wanted to be a defense attorney or whether I wanted to be a prosecutor. I knew I wanted to be able to reform the criminal justice system. And, being in this role, that's my job each and every day. I feel blessed to be the state's attorney for Baltimore City because all I have to do, all I'm charged with doing, is the right thing. Over these past 3 years, again, you were thrust into an incredible crucible with the uprising, obviously, and the death of Freddie Gray. But over these 3 years, as you look to being reelected, what things would you want to do different, or what would you want to improve upon in your capacity as state's attorney? So what I want to improve upon is I want to create better public-private partnerships. I think that when we I've talked about some of the initiatives within my office, the youth initiatives, the nonviolent felony drug offender initiatives that are geared toward economic opportunities. I want to be able to be a bridge. And we need to not just expand those programs, but figure out how we can really get to the systemic issues and think long-term, make that investment. And I'm willing to do that, and I just got to say, like, being in this role, you definitely sacrifice. I got a 7, I'm sorry, she'll kill me. She's 7 years old. I have a 7 and a 9-year-old. But what keeps me going is that this role is so much greater than me, and we have a unique opportunity in Baltimore to be a model for the rest of the country, and to get this criminal justice thing right. I have the only conviction integrity unit in the entire state of Maryland, where there's been 2 exonerations under my administration, where we're going to advocate for those that we think are guilty of crimes, but we also, as prosecutors in the pursuit of justice, have to assure that those that are wrongly accused and convicted are exonerated. The first Malcolm Bryant, he was incarcerated for 17 years. Wrongly, and thanks to DNA evidence, he was released. However, 3 months after he was released, think about this, 3 months later, he died. And I believe from the stress of being out and institutionalized. On top of that, just 2 weeks ago, we had another young man that spent 13 years incarcerated wrongly. And thanks to the community who stepped forward and said, you have the wrong person. So being in this role is greater than me. I feel like we have a unique opportunity. We have so much more work to do, and it's about that long-term investment.
Baltimore City State's Attorney Marilyn Mosby, thank you for joining us for our inaugural episode of the AFRO First Edition. We appreciate you.
No, thank you. I'm so proud of you.
Thank you.